The first sound was a scream, a raw, panicked cry that ripped through the early morning silence of a Houston suburb. It was just past 5 o'clock, the kind of hour when a family home should be still, when the world outside is caught between night and dawn, but inside the Elliott household chaos was breaking loose. The scream was Meghan's, desperate and choking, cut short and replaced by ragged gasps that never quite made sense. Her twin brother, Benjamin, staggered toward her, clutching a kitchen knife slick with blood. He claimed he wasn't awake. He claimed he didn't know what he was doing. But the knife told another story, and the body of his sister told yet another. By the time first responders arrived, Meghan's breaths were shallow, her chest rising only because of the convulsions of a body fighting against collapse. Benjamin's voice carried through the house, frantic, but repeating the same haunting line, "I didn't mean it, I was asleep." It was the kind of detail that froze officers in place, not because they believed it, but because the sheer absurdity of the claim was so nakedly put forward. A twin brother insisting he'd killed his sister in his sleep. The walls of the home bore the streaks of chaos, blood on the carpet, a trail that led back to the kitchen where the knife had been pulled from its block, as though in some half-conscious ritual. Meghan's bedroom door was splintered from the frantic motion of her trying to get away. She was only 18, full of plans for college, her entire life in front of her. And yet, here she was, sprawled against the wall, her eyes glazed but still darting with the instinct to survive. She recognized her brother even in that final blur of clarity. She saw Benjamin's face, panicked, pale, and blank all at once. He dropped the knife when the sirens grew louder. He didn't run. He didn't try to cover the act. He just kept muttering the same line like a mantra, "I was sleepwalking. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." For investigators, those words were more than just bizarre. They were a puzzle. Sleepwalking defenses had been raised before, but almost never with an act this violent. The human brain can do strange things in states of parasomnia, yes. People have been documented driving cars, cooking meals, even leaving their homes in deep sleep. But to stab someone, your own sister, 20 times and insist you were asleep? That sounded less like a medical anomaly and more like a flimsy excuse. And yet, as officers questioned him, there was a strange flatness to Benjamin's tone. He wasn't hysterical the way most killers might be in the wake of realizing what they'd done. He was calm in moments, erratic in others, like someone straddling two worlds. The 911 recording later played in court captured the confusion in his voice. He told dispatchers he had woken up to find the knife in his hand. He said he looked down and saw Meghan bleeding, and that it didn't feel real. At one point, his voice cracked as he shouted for them to hurry, but then, moments later, he drifted back into near monotone, almost narrating the scene rather than living it. Experts would later dissect those calls second by second, questioning whether it was performance or genuine disorientation. Neighbors woke to the sound of sirens, lights flashing against their windows. They stood at their lawns, arms crossed against the chill, whispering about what had happened in the Elliott household. By sunrise, the news was already spreading: a young woman dead, her twin brother in custody, claiming sleepwalking as his defense. A story that sounded too wild to be true, and yet was unfolding right in their neighborhood. Benjamin Elliott wasn't a stranger to them. He and Meghan were well known as the quiet twins next door, polite, unassuming, the kind of teenagers who waved at neighbors and kept to themselves. They came from a family that seemed steady, ordinary, nothing in the outward image suggested violence or dysfunction. Which is why the shock was sharper, why the whispers cut deeper. No one could reconcile the Benjamin they thought they knew with the boy who now sat in the back of a police car, hand-stained, his voice still faintly audible through the cracked window. Back at the station, detectives pressed him. Did he and Meghan fight? Was there jealousy, resentment? He shook his head, insisted no. Did he plan it? No. Did he remember stabbing her? No. Did he remember even walking into her room? Again, no. He remembered going to bed, that was all. Then waking up, the knife in his hand, and Meghan bleeding. He wept when he said her name, but the tears came in staccato bursts, as if his body didn't know when to give them up. The autopsy later revealed the extent of Meghan's injuries: multiple stab wounds to her chest, neck, and torso. Some were deep, delivered with force. Others were shallow, as though from hesitation. The medical examiner testified that she had defensive wounds, cuts along her hands where she had tried to block the knife. That detail, in particular, hung heavy in the courtroom months later. It suggested Meghan was awake, conscious, fighting to live. If Benjamin had been sleepwalking, how could he have responded to her attempts at resistance? Wouldn't the physical resistance have woken him? The science of parasomnia, sleepwalking, sleep terrors, confusional arousals became a central part of the story. The defense leaned on it, painting Benjamin as a boy with a long history of sleep disturbances. They claimed he had walked through the house at night before, performed odd rituals in his sleep, spoken gibberish to family members who tried to wake him. But prosecutors countered that none of those episodes had ever escalated into violence. None had led him to retrieve a weapon. None had ended with blood on the walls. As the case unfolded, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. Benjamin and Meghan weren't just siblings, they were twins, born minutes apart, raised side by side through every milestone of childhood. They attended the same schools, played in the same yards, shared the same birthday cakes year after year. Friends described them as close, though not inseparable. Meghan was more social, outgoing, while Benjamin leaned quiet, introspective. They argued, as all siblings did, but nothing that suggested a fracture deep enough to explode into murder. That, perhaps, was what made the story so haunting. There was no clear motive. No pattern of abuse. No hidden grudge unearthed in diaries or text messages. Just a sudden rupture in the fabric of a family that had, until then, appeared intact. The lack of a motive became both a weakness for the prosecution and a strength. Juries don't like mysteries. They like narratives. And the simplest narrative is often the truest: Benjamin killed his sister. But the defense's narrative that he did it while unconscious was just strange enough to create doubt. The courtroom became a stage for experts in sleep science, psychiatrists, and forensic pathologists. They debated in jargon-heavy testimony, but at the heart of it was a chillingly human question: can someone truly kill without ever knowing it? Can violence come not from hate or rage, but from a brain misfiring in the dead of night? Meghan's friends sat through it all, their eyes red from crying, wearing shirts with her name, bracelets etched with her initials. They remembered her laughter, the way she lit up rooms, the way she cared for others. Her absence was a hollow no science could explain away. To them, Benjamin's claim of sleepwalking sounded like betrayal stacked upon tragedy, as if taking her life wasn't enough. Now he was trying to erase his responsibility. But Benjamin himself sat quiet for most of the proceedings. He didn't testify often, but when he did, his words were halting, his eyes fixed downward. He didn't lash out, didn't protest angrily. He seemed more bewildered than anything, like he too was trying to understand how his life had shattered overnight. Some jurors later admitted that his demeanor left them conflicted. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a boy drowning. By the end of the trial, the weight of evidence pressed too heavily against the sleepwalking defense. While experts acknowledged parasomnia could, in theory, lead to violence, they also pointed out how rare and extreme such cases were. And Benjamin's actions, retrieving a knife, stabbing multiple times, responding to his sister's resistance, suggested levels of intentionality inconsistent with deep sleep. The verdict came down, guilty of murder. But the sentence, 15 years, reflected some measure of the court's recognition that this was not a straightforward case of malice. It was violence wrapped in ambiguity, tragedy coated in mystery. 15 years was both too long for those who believed he hadn't meant it, and far too short for those who had lost Meghan forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. They asked questions about justice, about sleepwalking, about the future of the Elliott family. The parents, stricken, didn't answer. How could they? They had lost one child to death and the other to prison. No words could reconcile that. The story ended not with clarity, but with silence, the kind that follows when lives collapse in ways too strange for comprehension. And yet, for those who study crime, for those who seek to understand the thin line between consciousness and compulsion, the case of Benjamin and Meghan Elliott lingers as one of the strangest in modern memory. A story that begins with a scream in the night and spirals into a courtroom where science and sorrow collide. A story of twins bound by blood, undone by a blade, and forever remembered through the haunting question, was he asleep, or was he awake when he killed her? The trial began months later, but the atmosphere in the courthouse felt as if the crime had happened yesterday. Every detail was raw, every photograph a wound reopened, every piece of testimony a reminder that the twins' story had ended not in shared birthdays and futures, but in a nightmare etched in blood. The gallery filled with journalists, neighbors, classmates, and family members whose faces betrayed exhaustion and disbelief. For Meghan's friends, this was not just about justice but about preserving her humanity. For Benjamin's defense, it was about convincing a jury that intent could vanish under the veil of sleep, that the law must consider the mysteries of the human mind as much as the brutality of a knife. The prosecution wasted no time establishing their narrative. They presented photographs of the crime scene, the knife, the blood-soaked sheets, and the defensive wounds on Meghan's arms. The medical examiner explained with clinical precision how she had tried to fight off her attacker, how each wound told a story of desperation, of a body unwilling to surrender to death. These details, cold as they were, painted a picture prosecutors leaned on. Benjamin was awake, fully aware, and pressing forward despite his sister's resistance. They asked the jury to imagine Meghan's final moments, her voice pleading, her body recoiling. They asked if it was even possible for someone in a sleepwalking state to maintain such persistence. Benjamin sat only feet away, his expression drained of color, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap they seemed ready to snap. He did not meet the jury's eyes. His lawyers advised him not to. Instead, he focused on the table, the rhythm of his breath uneven, his jaw clenched. To some, his silence looked like shame. To others, it looked like fear. To his defense team, it was the only way forward. Let the experts speak for him, let science explain what his mouth could not. When the defense began their turn, they leaned heavily into the strangeness of sleepwalking cases. They called neurologists and psychiatrists who described parasomnia as a phenomenon still not fully understood, a twilight between waking and dreaming where motor functions can activate without conscious awareness. They cited historical cases, men who had driven cars across cities in their sleep, people who had cooked elaborate meals with no memory of it the next morning, even rare documented instances of violence erupting during sleepwalking. Each example was presented not as justification but as possibility, a way to widen the crack in certainty and remind the jury that human behavior does not always follow rational rules. One expert explained the mechanics, how during non-REM sleep, the brain could misfire signals, causing the body to move while the higher consciousness remained offline. He described it like a computer glitch, programs running without a user at the keyboard. The jurors scribbled notes, their brows furrowed, their eyes flicking between Benjamin and the doctor. Could this be what happened that night? Could Benjamin have been a marionette pulled by strings inside his brain? But the prosecution countered with their own experts. They insisted that while sleepwalking could lead to odd behavior, it almost never resulted in complex, goal-directed actions like retrieving a knife, entering a sibling's room, and sustaining multiple stabbing motions. They hammered home the fact that Meghan's defensive wounds suggested interaction, a back and forth, a resistance that should have triggered full awakening. The prosecutor, pacing the courtroom floor, looked directly at the jury and asked, "If you were asleep and someone fought back, wouldn't you wake up? Wouldn't pain, contact, screams pull you out of that fog?" It was a question that needed no expert to answer. It was designed to resonate with common sense. The most haunting moment came when the 911 call was played for the jury. The courtroom fell into silence as Benjamin's voice filled the room. He sounded panicked, yes, but there was an odd rhythm to his words. He told the dispatcher he didn't know what had happened, that he had woken with the knife in his hand, that Meghan was bleeding. His tone shifted between hysteria and eerie calm, a pattern that unsettled even the seasoned officers in attendance. For Meghan's family, hearing her name on his lips was unbearable. Some left the room, unable to endure the sound of his pleas. Others stayed, gripping tissues, their faces streaked with tears. The call was replayed more than once, every inflection dissected by both sides, every pause turned into a battlefield of interpretation. Was it genuine confusion or calculated performance? Outside the courthouse, the media turned the case into spectacle. Headlines blared about the sleepwalking killer, talk shows debated whether Benjamin was a monster or a victim of his own mind. Commentators dragged in other infamous cases where defendants had claimed unconsciousness, some acquitted, others convicted. Sleepwalking defenses were rare, but they always captured public imagination because they touched on something terrifying, the idea that the body could betray you, that you could become violent without ever choosing it. For parents across the country reading the news, it was a chilling prospect. For scientists, it was a chance to debate the limits of free will and accountability. For Meghan's loved ones, it was salt in a wound, a reminder that the girl they had lost was becoming a headline rather than a memory. Benjamin's defense team tried to humanize him. They called friends and family to the stand who testified about his lifelong struggles with sleep. They recounted stories of him wandering the house at night, speaking incoherently, standing over their beds in silence before shuffling back to his room. His mother wept as she described how she once found him in the kitchen at 2 a.m, preparing food with no awareness of what he was doing. Teachers spoke about his introverted nature, his lack of aggression, his gentle disposition. All of it was meant to build a portrait of a boy incapable of deliberate cruelty, someone whose actions that night could only be explained by forces outside his control. But the prosecution dismantled these portraits with relentless focus. They asked why, if Benjamin had a history of sleepwalking, the family had never sought medical intervention. They pressed witnesses on whether any of those past incidents had involved aggression or violence. They underscored the deliberate nature of the stabbing, pointing to the sheer number of wounds as evidence of intent. One prosecutor held the knife in court, its blade gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and asked the jury to imagine the repeated thrusts, the force, the precision. "This is not sleep," he said. "This is murder." Day after day, testimony piled up, and with it, the tension inside the courtroom thickened. Jurors shifted in their seats, weighed down by the responsibility of parsing science and emotion, fact and possibility. Some were visibly moved by the defense's arguments, others hardened by the prosecution's insistence on accountability. The duality mirrored the larger world outside. Some saw Benjamin as a tragic figure caught in a nightmare, others as a cold-blooded killer hiding behind a convenient excuse. Throughout it all, Meghan's absence hung over the proceedings like a shadow. Her photographs lined the courtroom walls, her smile beaming from school portraits, snapshots with friends, moments frozen in time. Witnesses broke down describing her kindness, her dreams of college, her plans to study psychology. Every word brought her back into the room, every tear reminded the jury that this was not an abstract debate but a life cut short. Her future would never unfold, her laughter silenced forever. The defense could argue about brain states and parasomnia, but the prosecution had a simple, undeniable truth: Meghan was dead, and Benjamin's hands held the knife. As closing arguments approached, both sides sharpened their final appeals. The defense reminded the jury that reasonable doubt was the standard, not certainty. They asked the jurors to consider the possibility, however strange, that Benjamin truly had no memory of the act, that his mind had betrayed him. They pointed to his immediate confession, his lack of attempt to flee, his consistent story from the very first 911 call. They argued that these were not the behaviors of a calculated murderer but of someone bewildered by his own actions. The prosecution, in contrast, struck at the heart. They told the jury that doubt should not be stretched into fantasy. They reminded them that Meghan's defensive wounds, the multiple stab marks, and the very nature of the act demanded accountability. They painted Benjamin's calmness on the 911 call not as confusion but as manipulation. They warned that to accept the sleepwalking defense would set a dangerous precedent, a loophole that could be exploited by anyone willing to feign confusion. If we excuse this, the prosecutor thundered, what message do we send to every victim who never lived to tell their story? The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of two lives pressing down on them, Meghan's, lost forever, and Benjamin's, hanging in the balance. When they returned, the courtroom stilled, every breath caught in anticipation. The foreperson stood, hands trembling, and delivered the verdict, guilty of murder. Gasps rippled through the gallery, tears erupted, Benjamin's shoulders slumped. His parents, caught between devastation and resignation, clutched each other as if trying to hold together the shards of a family that had been shattered beyond repair. The sentence was 15 years in prison. To some, it was lenient, an insult to Meghan's memory. To others, it was merciful, a recognition that this crime was not born of malice but of something far more complex and tragic. 15 years, long enough to erase youth, short enough to leave questions lingering. Was justice served, or had the court simply chosen the lesser of impossible answers? Outside, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, reporters shouting for statements. Meghan's friends sobbed in each other's arms. Benjamin was led away, his face expressionless, his body seeming smaller than his age. His last glance toward his parents was fleeting, almost childlike, as if he were still hoping to wake from the nightmare. But the nightmare was real, and it was far from over. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon, the crowd dispersing into the humid Texas air. For some, the verdict offered closure, a line drawn under months of pain and speculation. For others, it left a lingering unease, a feeling that the truth had slipped through the cracks. Benjamin Elliott was found guilty, sentenced to 15 years, but what haunted people was not just what he had done, but the possibility that he truly might not have been awake when he did it. That question clung to the case like a shadow that no verdict could erase. Meghan was gone. Her funeral had been held long before the trial, a gathering of classmates, teachers, neighbors, and family who spoke of her warmth and her kindness. They laid her to rest with letters tucked into the coffin, bracelets slipped around her wrists, photographs placed beside her. The grief in the community was palpable. She had been only 18, a girl on the cusp of her future, preparing for college, dreaming of studying psychology, helping others understand the human mind. That dream, cruelly, now lived only in memory. Every courtroom testimony, every newspaper article, every broadcast about the trial forced her parents to relive not only her death but the gruesome details of it. And now, though the trial was over, the grief remained, an endless echo in the quiet corners of their home. For Benjamin, the next chapter was prison. At 18, he entered a world designed to swallow the unprepared, a world where routine replaced freedom, where time moved in circles instead of lines. He was no longer the twin brother who once sat across from Meghan at the dinner table, he was an inmate, a number, a face in a crowd of men marked by their own violent pasts. Reports from the correctional officers suggested he kept mostly to himself, rarely engaging in altercations, often retreating into books and classes offered by the facility. Some saw him as fragile, someone who did not belong in a place like this. Others viewed him with suspicion, unable to reconcile his quiet demeanor with the brutality of the crime that put him there. Within prison walls, reputations spread quickly, and Benjamin's was an odd one, the boy who said he killed his sister in his sleep. Among hardened inmates, the story was both laughable and chilling. Some mocked him, others left him alone. To them, guilt was guilt, no matter how it was framed. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the debate raged on. Sleepwalking defenses were dissected on television programs, in law schools, across dinner tables. The case reignited old discussions about free will and criminal responsibility. Could a person be held accountable for actions committed in a state of unconsciousness? Was Benjamin's trial an example of justice done right, or of science ignored in favor of certainty? Experts weighed in from across the country. Some argued that his behavior fit known patterns of parasomnia, pointing out that extreme stress, adolescence, and a history of sleep issues could create the perfect storm for violence during sleepwalking. Others dismissed it outright, emphasizing the rarity of such cases and the deliberate nature of the stabbing. The line between science and skepticism blurred, leaving the public caught between fascination and unease. For Meghan's friends, none of the debate mattered. They returned to classrooms without her, went to dances without her, graduated without her. Her absence lingered in the spaces she should have filled. At memorial services held each year, her name was spoken through tears, her photographs framed by flowers. They remembered her laughter, her kindness, the way she dreamed about helping others. To them, she was not a case study or a headline, she was simply Meghan, and she was gone. No explanation, scientific or otherwise, could soften that truth. The Elliott family, once bound by the closeness of twins, became a family divided by grief. Parents who once celebrated shared birthdays now marked them with silence. The house that had once echoed with two voices now stood quiet, haunted by memories. Visiting Benjamin in prison was a ritual heavy with contradiction. He was still their son, but he was also the one who had taken their daughter. Forgiveness was not simple, and love became tangled with anger, sorrow, and confusion. Some visits ended in tears, others in silence, but they kept coming. To abandon him would be to lose both children completely. To hold on was to carry a burden almost too heavy to bear. As Benjamin adjusted to prison life, he enrolled in therapy sessions offered to inmates. Records from those sessions described him as withdrawn but cooperative, a young man grappling with fragments of memory and guilt. He often insisted he did not remember the attack itself, only the aftermath, waking with the knife, seeing Meghan's blood, calling 911. He spoke about dreams, about flashes of fear, about nights when he woke to find himself standing in his cell without recalling how he got there. Whether these accounts were true or imagined, they painted a picture of someone who continued to wrestle with the boundary between sleep and wakefulness, between responsibility and confusion. Therapists noted his remorse, but also the ambiguity of his narrative. Was he clinging to the sleepwalking defense because it was his truth, or because it was his only lifeline? Even they could not say for certain. Years passed, but the story did not fade. True crime podcasts revisited the case, documentaries dissected it, writers explored the psychology of sleepwalking violence through Benjamin's story. Each retelling carried its own angle, some sympathetic, others condemning. The phrase sleepwalking killer became attached to his name, a label that reduced the complexity of the tragedy into something sensational, easy to package for headlines but harder to reconcile with reality. For Meghan's friends and family, this was an additional wound, her story, her life, often overshadowed by the strangeness of his defense. She became the victim in narratives that focused more on the mystery of sleepwalking than on the fullness of who she was. Inside prison, Benjamin counted the years. 15 sounded long at sentencing, but time has a way of slipping in strange ways behind bars. Days bled into each other, months folded into years. Letters came and went, some from family, some from strangers who had followed the case. Some letters accused him, others offered sympathy, a few even claimed to believe in his innocence. He read them all, rarely replying. In the quiet of his cell, he thought about Meghan, about childhood memories that now felt like scenes from another life. Birthdays they had shared, games they had played, secrets only twins can understand. He wondered if those memories belonged to the same person who had held the knife, or if that person was someone else entirely, a version of himself he would never fully know. For society, the Elliott case became a reminder of how thin the line can be between explanation and excuse. Sleepwalking defenses remained rare, but each time they surfaced, they forced courts and communities to confront unsettling questions. How much control do we really have over our actions? Can science ever fully explain the darkness that sometimes emerges in human behavior? And what does justice look like when certainty is impossible? The law demands accountability, but human lives do not always fit neatly into categories of guilty or innocent, awake or asleep. Benjamin's release date will come. 15 years is not forever. When it does, he will walk out of prison as a man in his 30s, carrying the weight of what happened that night for the rest of his life. Meghan will not be there. She will forever be 18, frozen in memory, her future imagined but never lived. Their parents will be older, marked by years of grief and divided loyalties. The community will remember the twins not for the lives they lived but for the night that ended one and ruined the other. And yet, even when his sentence is complete, the case will not end. It will live on in textbooks, in court discussions, in late-night conversations where people wonder aloud whether sleepwalking could ever truly explain violence. It will remain in the memories of those who loved Meghan, who keep her alive through stories and memorials. It will remain in Benjamin's own silence, the unanswered question of what he knew and what he didn't. Was it a dream? Was it deliberate? Did his mind betray him, or was sleepwalking just a mask for something darker? The story of Benjamin and Meghan Elliott is not just a crime story. It is a tragedy that refuses to resolve, a knot that cannot be untangled. It is the story of two lives intertwined by birth, separated by violence, and bound forever in a narrative that chills because it offers no clean answers. It begins with a scream in the night and ends with silence, a silence that echoes still, leaving behind the unsettling truth that sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are not those of monsters lurking in the dark, but of the human mind itself. Benjamin Elliott shocked the world when he claimed he was sleepwalking after fatally stabbing his twin sister, Meghan, in their Texas home. This true crime documentary story follows the haunting night of the murder, the eerie 911 call, the courtroom battle, and his 15-year sentence. A chilling tale of family tragedy, sleepwalking defense, and a crime that blurred the line between dream and reality.